No, good morning, Mr. Rami.
Good morning, my lord. Our first witness today is Ian Tasker, who's Chief Executive of Scottish Hazards, and his statement reference for the record is SCI WT 0377501.
Very good, thank you. Good morning, Mr. Tasker.
Good morning, my lord.
Now, when you're ready, Mr. Rami.
Thank you, my lord. Mr. Tasker, good morning. Could you please start by telling us a bit about your own background and role within Scottish Hazards, and also a brief account of Scottish Hazards and its activities?
Yeah. My own background and where I became interested in health and safety was when I worked for the Clydesdale Bank, and I was a trade union health and safety rep at that time. Later seconded to the Banking, Insurance and Finance Union to carry out full-time trade union duties. And I then left the Clydesdale Bank and joined the Scottish Trade Union Congress, where I was responsible initially for developing health and safety policy for the trade union movement. I later became an assistant secretary, but maintained that responsibility for health and safety policy. 7 years ago, I left STUC to go part-time with Scottish Hazards. Scottish Hazards is an occupational health and safety charity that provides health and safety advice, representation and support to people who are not in trade unions, so therefore don't enjoy that trade union premium in relation to healthy and safe work. And latterly, just on the onset of COVID, because the casework was increasing so rapidly, I had to move from 3 days a week to 5 days a week, which is still the position.
Thank you. Now, the casework you mentioned, Scottish Hazards handles that through its helpline. Can you tell us a bit about how the helpline functioned, the type and volume of cases prior to the pandemic?
Prior to the outbreak of COVID, we would normally handle or deal with roughly five cases per month. These cases could vary in complexity. They could mainly be just a case of get one phone call, giving advice, or it could go to the other end of the scale, which was providing that advice and support and representation to try and help people resolve their employment issues. Again, once COVID broke out, I think it was about the May, we rebranded our helpline, particularly as a COVID helpline. We continued to do the more general casework, but quite clearly there was a need, given the calls that were coming through the helpline, that we really needed to focus on providing that advice and support to people who, in all honesty, had nowhere else to go to get that advice.
Yeah. What sort of increase in volume of calls did you see before the restrictions were applied, when people were becoming aware of it, and then once the restrictions were in place?
It was very much a trickle to start off with, up until that point where the restrictions were put in place. Yes. And at that time, the guidance that was coming out did include reference to Scottish Hazards as being a source of support. And that's when we started to know the quite rapid increase in the amount of calls that were coming through. But it was rapid at that stage, then it was rapid in the second lockdown as well. So there was two peaks basically, but clearly a lot of these cases involved substantial amount of work. They were very rarely straightforward compared to the more general casework.
Yes. Did Scottish Hazards ask the Scottish Government to include the helpline in its guidance, or is that something the Government did independently?
That probably came about as an output of the Safer Workplaces group that was set up quite rapidly after the outbreak of COVID, in which the STUC was involved at that time, and the Scottish Government also I think through the SUC became aware of the work that Scottish Hazards was doing, and that's where the reference to Scottish Hazards came about.
Yes, thank you. And I understand from your statement that the Scottish Government provided funding for the helpline. How did that funding allow you to adapt the service so that you could deal with more callers?
I mean, we're a very small charity at that time. There was only myself and one part-time caseworker. We could not have. It didn't allow us. It didn't allow us to employ any more staff. It just meant that for that period, I could work solely on COVID casework, with the other caseworker picking up the more general casework.
Okay.
Because he was picking up more casework, then there was a financial resource, an additional financial resource on the organisation.
Thank you. And can you tell us about the types of workers who called the helpline, what sectors they were in, what sort of roles they had, what sort of contracts they had?
It was public, private, third sector, across all business sectors, all business sizes. We mainly, I would say, workers as opposed to those in managerial or supervisory grade, or business owners, although to be said, not so much in what we're dealing with today, which is health and social care, but certainly in the broader business sectors, we did see an amount of employers actually contacting us to seek our advice, particularly when the restrictions were lifting in relation to how they could put in place measures to ensure the health and safety and welfare of their staff as they were coming back to work.
Thank you. In paragraph 35 of your statement, you say that in very few of the cases did Scottish Hazards contact employers owing to the reluctance of workers. Please could you expand on that, including why workers were reluctant and whether Scottish Hazards tried to persuade them to allow contact?
I mean, our model is based on the same model as you would find in trade unionised workplaces, which is to try to encourage people to resolve their grievances directly with the employer. And it became clear, and it was well known through various pieces of research across the world, that trade unionised workplaces are safer workplaces and they're healthier workplaces. And that's purely down to the structures that are within, are set up within these workplaces to ensure that workers' views are actually taken into account. These structures were not evident in the organisations that we were dealing with. And even in trade unionised workplaces, people are often reluctant to go down a grievance procedure because they feel that there will be repercussions. And that is more so in the non-unionised workplaces we were dealing with. And we tried to encourage people to go as far as possible. And we would, as I said earlier, we provide advice, support and representation. And the representation is the important part, because if an individual had felt confident in raising a grievance, and many of these people were, that legitimate grievances, then we would have provided that representation. In not one case did we provide representation at a grievance meeting.
Yes. Do you think that there's anything that could be done in future to address this issue?
I mean, the Scottish Government has an ambition that fair work will be the basis of our economy by 2025. As part of that, and the underlying dimension of fair work is effective voice. And we would say that in trade unionised workplaces, that is obviously where the effective voice lies, is in trade union representation. But in non-trade unionised workplaces, we don't believe they're even following their, or in many cases, employers are not following their obligations to consult with staff on health and safety. And this was a matter of health and safety at work, and we don't think that was actually. I don't think that really got through to some employers, that they had a general obligation to provide that duty of care to their employees, and they weren't looking at it from that angle. I think they were looking at it from very much a public health emergency.
Do you think there's anything that could be done? Do you have any thought, does Scottish Hazards have any thoughts on anything that could be done to make non-unionised workers less reluctant to have someone approach their employers?
I mean, I think under the whole effective voice, there are mechanisms whereby, certainly in relation to health and social care, whereby employers who are receiving public funding in relation to provide the funds for them to carry out their business activities, they should have to demonstrate that they have procedures in place to ensure that there are these effective voice mechanisms, and they are consulting with staff on health and safety matters. Two sets of legislation in relation to what employers need to do in relation to consultation on health and safety. One is the Safety Reps and Safety Committees Regulations 1974, and the other is for non-unionised workplaces, Health and Safety Consultation with Employee Regulations 1996. They're two pieces of legislation designed to do the same thing, but the impact on the legislation covering the non-unionised workplaces, I think, has been hampered by it's not being enforced.
Thank you. Now, going back to the helpline, when you were getting calls at the point before government guidance was being issued, how were you addressing concerns, and on what basis were you able to provide advice?
I mean, the advice that we provided was basically based on my experience as a trade union health and safety and understanding of risk assessment, etc. And looking at the likelihood of what people, callers were telling us in relation to their concerns, and against the potential severity of harm arising from the individual case, and really basing a judgment on that, how we thought there may, or what harm may arise from that particular caller. And a lot of cases, it was just about providing advice to the individual in relation to what they could be doing, what the opportunities were, and supporting them to make the decision in relation to what they wanted to do. Yes. In the cases that we actually, in the cases in relation to health and social care, I think I maybe wrote to 2 or 3 employers out of what we see as 40, 50 cases. And it has to be said, that was mainly around not being able to work from home. And clearly, if people had been working from home in the first lockdown, then they should have been working from home in the second lockdown, and that was a message that was lost across all sectors.
Thank you. You go on in paragraphs 45 and 46 to state that you believe employers were focused on business continuity and not focused enough on health and safety at work. Can you tell us what caused you to believe that that was the case, and that there wasn't enough focus on health and safety?
I mean, that view is based on, again, on the fact that I just mentioned that they did not seem to spend a lot of time looking at how they could reduce the risk. They wanted a quick return to the workplace, and in some cases that we dealt with, that was quite clearly against the law and the guidance and the restrictions that were in place at the time. And we obviously, as a responsible organisation, would agree that business continuity is vitally important because that protects jobs. But at the same time, if that demand for business continuity impacts on the health and safety of the people that are employed in that organisation, then we have an issue. It was a fine balance between the demand for business and continuity and protecting health and safety of workers, and I think sometimes they fell on the wrong side of that balance.
Thank you. And at paragraph 48, you talk about the difference a consultation group could have made. By this, do you mean consultation groups within each employer and organisation?
Yeah, that was something that we never came across once.
And in your experience, did the lack of such a group prevent effective communication within employment organisations, or could there have been effective communication without that?
I mean, I think we refer back to the regulations covering the obligations to consult under the non-unionised regulations. They still have a duty to consult on health and safety, to take into account the concerns of workers, and to put in place work to ensure that these concerns are addressed. But what we found was that consultation was not taking place. Communication was taking place, but there's a difference between the two.
Okay.
You know, and communication tended to be one way.
In paragraph 51, you say that, following on from that, communication and consultation with staff in relation to initial planning would also have allayed many fears. In particular, knowing that matters were being considered would have gone a long way. By that, do you mean that even if things were done in the same way, but staff were more aware of issues actually being considered by employers, that they would have been less anxious and less concerned?
Yeah. I think, if an employer engages with staff, that's not to mean to say that every concern raised by workers will be taken on board by the employers, and nor should it be. But having that discussion and consultation, and as part of that consultation, the employer responding to the workers to state, yes, we'll do that, or no, we can't do that, but providing reasons why they cannot do it.
Thank you. So, then later on, as you discuss the points that you've raised just now, you state that at paragraph 55 that the ability for employers to ignore Scottish Government guidance perhaps meant they were less effective than they might have been, referring to the Scottish Government measures.
Yeah.
There was no enforcement and the COVID regulatory framework was confused. Could you tell us what you mean when you say the framework was confused?
I mean, clearly there was a lot of regulatory bodies involved in this, from Police Scotland, Health and Safety Executive, Local Authority, Environmental Health Departments, Care Inspectorate, you know, and really we had conflicts at times in relation to who was doing what and who was responsible for overseeing the restrictions that were in place. Face coverings was the most major problem. It was a major problem for us. In the early days, neither the police nor the local authority environmental health officers seemed to have an understanding of who should be enforcing that. And on one occasion, and it was not a health and social care case, but we were passed round. You know, from we contacted the local authority. They said it was a police matter. The police said it was a local authority issue. So it was a complicated regulatory framework, as I said. But you know, and I think the fact that from the from the April in 2020, there was an obligation on employers to report COVID cases in the workplace where they thought that transmission may have taken place in the workplace. But on the other hand, the public health guidance seemed to be that you shouldn't report general COVID cases in the workplace if there was evidence that there was a community infection out there. And we found that a bit ludicrous that, somebody could bring COVID into the workplace from another local authority area, but that transmission was not work-related. Yes. We just found that strange. And that was, I think, the most serious conflict between the two regulators, I think.
Yeah, thank you. What, if anything, do you think the Scottish Government could have done to address the issue of enforcement?
I mean, clearly, they had powers. They had powers within the Public Health Scotland, the Public Health Act 2008, but only came into effect. These enforcement powers only came into effect just shortly before COVID broke. But really, I think there should have been more and more visible work done between Public Health Scotland and the HSE and local authorities to try and I think get on top of workplace outbreaks, but also to get the learning that out of these enforcement visits, because I think that is key to enforcement, is that, and it's not just about sanction, it's about identifying what's happening in these workplaces and getting that communicated out more broadly to ensure that the impact of the COVID infection could be more controlled.
At paragraph 57, you state little consideration appeared to be given to reducing the risk of infection in other ways involving elimination or substitution of the risk, or managing the risk through engineering or administrative control measures. Could you tell us what you mean, firstly, by managing the risk through engineering, and secondly, through administrative control measures?
Yeah. I mean, I think in relation to that is based on the hierarchy of risk, where the very last point in the hierarchy of risk is PPE, and that should be only adopted after all the other controls have been examined and exhausted. So in relation to engineering controls, you would probably be looking at fresh air and ventilation within your workplace to ensure that an adequate supply of fresh air is being delivered, which is a legal obligation. In relation to administrative controls, that would look at if you had a vulnerable worker who was working in a public-facing role, you would maybe look at how work tasks could be reallocated so that individual could continue and work but not be public-facing and not have that increased risk of infection.
Thank you. And then in paragraph 58, you state that in our experience, risk assessments were largely non-existent in non-unionised workplaces, and you've mentioned that in your evidence today. I wonder, what size were these organisations typically, and could it be that some, due to their smaller size, lacked resources and the knowledge to carry out adequate risk assessments?
I mean, I think the law states that anybody employing 5 or more people have to carry out a risk assessment and document the findings. Under 5, then they still have to carry out a risk assessment, but they don't have to record the findings. We dealt with, as I said earlier, with organisations of various sizes. I think potentially at the lower end, the smaller business sector, then yes, they they may not have been fully aware of what they had to do in order to carry out risk assessment. But at the same time, they have a legal obligation to do that. But we actually, in the very early days of COVID, we developed a model risk assessment, which is still on our website today, and that was aimed at if people called us, as they all frequently did, and asked, if they asked, I think we asked 2 questions. Have you seen your employer's risk assessment for COVID, and were you consulted about it? And clearly, if they answered no to the first one, then the second one was pointless. Yeah. But we provided that material for them to take to their employer to say, we need to do, or you need to do this, and we want to be involved in that process.
And did you find that to be effective? Were people quite receptive to that?
I think they were. The response to us, would be that they would do that, and they would find out if there was a risk assessment. Now, the problem was that people rarely got back to us to provide, whether they had done that. I had no reason to believe that they would not do it. So I took that as an assumption that they'd taken that to the employer, and the employer had carried out their obligation to do that risk assessment.
Thank you. In paragraphs 67 to 70, you talk about pregnant workers. Please could you tell us about some of the issues highlighted by pregnant women who contacted the helpline?
I mean, it was obviously mainly, and it was always in relation to the impact that the impact COVID may have in relation to their pregnancy, and we dealt with workers at all stages of their pregnancy in relation to steps their employers should be taking and were not taking to ensure the health of the pregnant worker, but also the unborn child. And clearly, as the pregnancy developed into the third semester, that started to create, I think, issues and concerns for the women. And we relied a lot on the maternity alliance for the information that we were giving out to women. But again, and it goes back to risk assessment, that I think there was a lack of awareness that when a woman informs their employer that she is pregnant, then they have to review their risk assessment. They don't necessarily have to carry out an independent risk assessment on the pregnant women, but they have to review their general risk assessment. And we would argue that when COVID came along, then they should have been doing a specific individual risk assessment for a pregnant woman. It's when the risk assessment tool came along in relation to vulnerable workers, we did find that some employers were using that to carry out that same process in relation to pregnant workers as they were doing for other vulnerable workers.
What sort of issues were impacting women? What did they contact you about? Were they matters that you were able to help them resolve in quite a simple way, or were they more structural issues?
Again, it was complex, and it also depended on the willingness of the employer to act on the information we were providing the individual. One case that we did, it was a colleague that actually dealt with that, was in relation to a care worker who was pregnant, and she was actually using her annual leave to reduce the risk of her catching transmission in the care home she worked in, because there'd been a number of COVID deaths within that workplace. And while she was on annual leave, the employer placed a number of people on furlough, but not including herself. So my colleague wrote to the employer, and I think it was still a struggle, but the result was that individual was placed on furlough as well, thus eliminating the risk of her contracting COVID in the workspace, which goes back to the risk hierarchy that really, if you were looking at furlough and you had vulnerable workers in that work environment, then we would argue that they should have been the first ones that were placed on furlough.
Yeah. Thank you. You then go on in paragraphs 71 to 79 of your statement to talk further about risk assessments and the absence of those. In paragraph 74, you state, "We were disappointed to witness so many employers failing in their legal obligations to carry out risk assessments, and even more so that enforcement authorities seem powerless to do anything." Do you think that the Scottish Government should have taken prompt action to enable the authorities to act, or do you think they had the power but didn't act, and in that case, should the government have stepped in to prompt them to act?
I mean, again, because health and safety is a reserve function, while the enforcement of a lot of health and safety regulations and workplaces lie with local authority environmental health officers. We had good relationships with some local authorities, not so much others, but the whole issue in relation to, sorry, what paragraph is that in?
So 74.
74, yeah. Yeah. So the way that health and safety the way that health and safety enforcement seemed to take place at the time, and we can understand why the reasons may be so, was by telephone calls. You know, and we had a problem in relation to carrying out health and safety by telephone calls, because you're not actually inspecting the workplace and seeing what's happening. The HSE, which is an organisation that clearly has been starved of resources over the years and are trimmed to the bone in relation to inspection staff, they employed a number of, they're not inspectors because they did not hold a warrant card, so they could not demand to get into a workplace. But what they were doing in the early days was seeking if they could get access to a workplace, carrying out a review of their social distancing and infection control measures that they'd taken, but they did not ask the question on whether they had carried out a risk assessment, because they were not allowed to ask that question. That actually came later on, where these individuals, and I can't even remember the name they were given, but they were, private sector contractors. But it was only later on that they started asking questions in relation to COVID risk assessments and how effective these COVID risk assessments may be. I am presuming at some point they'd been trained on risk assessment, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. In paragraphs 80 to 87, you talk about shielding workers. Can you tell us about the particular issues this group of workers contacted you about during the lockdowns, and also once the Scottish Government announced that those who were shielding could return to work?
Yeah, I think we received a number of calls during from shielding workers, during the time that they could not go outside the home, and it was quite clear that their mental health was being, impacted by that decision that they had to shield. There was very little contact, in our view, from employers to shielded staff to ask about their welfare, etc. And that was all we could really do, was to try and provide some sort of comfort to them, but also try to establish that contact with the employer and ask, just make a demand that this is what they want put in place. As as the shielding was lifted, and clearly it was lifted later in Scotland than it was in England, we had some issues in relation to, I've been told to go back to work. I said, no, you can't. Shielding is still in place in Scotland, and that happened across a wide range of these restrictions as they were lifted earlier in England. Some employers who perhaps operated across the UK followed the English guidance, and not the ones that was not the guidance that was in place by the Scottish Government. That caused a lot of problems. But again, the risk assessment process states that if there's a substantial change in relation to the matter to which that risk assessment applies, then they should carry out a review of the risk assessment. Now, I would say that was patently obvious as people who'd been shielding were coming back to work, that there should have been a review of the COVID risk assessment. Again, looking at things like reallocation of tasks to try to ensure that people could come back to a safe and healthy workplace. And there was a concern after being, 4 months or whatever, isolated. And there was a concern that once they went back to work, they would remain isolated in the workplace as well, because they'd been away for so long and not been speaking to colleagues. So, you know, I think the passage back into work for shielded workers could have been managed more effectively.
And you state in paragraph 83 that Scottish Hazards would have liked to have seen stronger guidance issued by the Scottish Government to ensure fears of workers could be allayed to some extent when returning from shielding. So that follows on from that point. Could you provide examples of the type of guidance you think would have made a difference?
I mean, I think it should have been made perfectly clear that that risk assessment had to take place. They had to engage with the shielding workers prior to them returning to work to ensure that they were confident in returning to work, and just having that discussion. We see when people return to work after a long absence, then the employers will carry out returning to work, a return to work interview or a process, and the shielded workers that we spoke to, I think they were phoning us just before they were due to go back to work, and they had a lot of concerns about returning to work, but that was part of it, is it had not been explained what they were returning to.
In paragraphs 88 to 93, you speak about work-related transport. This is an issue that's been brought up a number of times by other witnesses too. In the cases that you were contacted about, did the issues mainly relate to pool vehicles or public transport or both? Or other types of transport too?
I think it was, clearly a lot of health and social care workers have to use public transport to get to work, and that includes people that work in hospitals. But we were getting these concerns raised by individuals who had to use public transport or pooled cars as part of their daily duties, but also those who have to use public transport to get to work and get home were looking for a bit of latitude to perhaps travel at less busy times and reduce the chance of transmission. And again, I think often the reaction was that this is not our responsibility. How you get to work and get home from work is up to you. And really, we suggested that they could have been far more accommodating in relation to these requests. In relation to pool cars, concerns tended to be around they were jumping into a vehicle that they didn't know had been properly sanitised. And we tried to encourage them to get the employer to reduce or to introduce a sanitising process that involved the user of the car sanitising it when they left, and then the new user coming in and doing another sanitisation, which is, to us, was the only way that you could guarantee the proper infection control measures were being put in place. I think the issue in relation to that was that people were not given enough time to do that. And I think there was another, you asked another question, didn't you, in relation to?
Well, firstly, it was that question, but then in paragraph 92, you mentioned that one care worker wanted to use her own car. Was she allowed to do that?
Yeah, I think we got to the stage in. I'm just trying to. So we got to the stage in that case where the individual was allowed to use their own car, which was actually insured for business purposes. Okay. So the individual had been allowed to use her car in the past, but for some reason, the management and I think it goes back to the question you asked earlier about were businesses aware of what they needed to do in relation to risk assessment, and I think that maybe introduces another point, is whether line managers were aware of what they needed to be doing. And I think that's where a lot of the problems started to, or were created, just with line managers taking a view that the care had to be delivered, and they were actually in control of how that care was going to be delivered, and not the individual who was delivering the care.
Did you see, were you aware of other people also resorting to using their own cars, or was that an exceptional case?
I think that was in my recollection, that was the only one that we came across like that. We knew people were using their own cars, but it had not been raised as an issue. And it has to be said that it's still a case that many care workers are using their own cars and they're properly insured, etc.
Is there anything you consider that the Scottish Government could have done in relation to work transport, particularly in respect of public transport?
I mean, I think the Scottish Government guidance probably went as far as they could, I think, reasonably do, which was to travel at quiet periods, to ensure windows, etc., were open, that really you maintain social distancing on public transport. All of these things are sort of precautionary measures, but other than putting on additional transport services, that wasn't going to happen because there was a lack of bus drivers anyway. So really, I think the guidance that the Scottish Government issued was reasonable. As I said, the way that perhaps those using public transport chose to follow that guidance or not, I think was the issue, because people were jumping on public transport to get to work or during their work and finding that people were not wearing face coverings, for instance. So, all in all, I don't think the Scottish Government could have done much more. I think it was a case of whether people were following that guidance or not, and that goes back to enforcement of it.
Yeah. So again, enforcement on public transport is an area that perhaps more thought should be given to in future.
Yeah, and that is within, because quite clearly it would be environmental health departments that would that would enforce that. So that would be within the Scottish Government to say that we would want certain levels of enforcement activity, whether that was Police Scotland or environmental health officers, to ensure that transport. I mean, I can recall seeing British Transport Police on trains,
Yes.
and they were speaking to people who were not wearing face coverings to ensure that they had a reason for being exempted.
You then go on to speak about vaccinations and vaccinations being mandatory in care homes, in nursing homes in England. You state that those care home operators that were UK-wide companies applied English guidance. In those cases, are you aware of why they did that rather than allowing Scottish care homes to follow the Scottish guidance? And was Scottish Hazards able to intervene in any of these cases to ensure application of Scottish guidance?
Yeah, we actually supported the GMB trade union and provided advice in relation to one particular care home company who was taking a hard line in relation to vaccinations. Now, our view was that that's a hard line in relation to guidance that applied in England but did not apply in Scotland. And I think they were looking at the possibility of taking employment tribunal cases. But our view, and I think we were torn here, that we saw vaccination as a crucial measure in relation to the fight back against COVID. But people in Scotland at that time, they had a choice on whether they chose to have the vaccination or not. And a UK-wide employer was quite clearly imposing a condition on their employment that was not within the guidance at the time here.
Do you think any steps could have been taken to prevent employers from enforcing English guidance on their employees?
Yeah, I mean, we raised a number of issues, and we reported every month to the Safer Workplaces group, and that would have been one of the issues that would have been in our report. Clearly, I mean, employment legislation is also a reserved matter. So the Scottish Government, I think, other than perhaps sending out a strong message to care home employers that they should not be disciplining individuals who exert their right to not have a vaccination, and that probably did not happen.
Thank you. At paragraphs 118 to 120, you talk about the financial impacts of the pandemic, and you state that the Scottish Trade Union Congress and the Scottish Government negotiated a Fair Work statement to ensure there would be no financial detriment to health and social care workers should they be absent from work due to COVID-19, or separately a requirement to self-isolate, but that this wasn't followed by all employers, including employers in the public sector. Was this down to the way funding applications for that scheme were administered?
I mean, I dealt with a number of individuals and employers and small businesses who found the whole process a bit hard to negotiate, because the funding was provided by the Scottish Government but administered by the local authorities, and I think there was like a postcode lottery in relation to how easy it was to actually negotiate the process, but also to actually receive any level of funding from it. So I think that could have been, more universally applied and easier to apply for. In relation to small businesses, a number contacted us and were, I think, in serious danger of having to close permanently because they were having the same problems with the business support grants. One employer who did provide cleaning services to businesses operating in the health and social care sector, particularly dentist surgeries, because that income stream had been removed, his business was struggling.
Can you tell us a bit more about the impact on individual workers as well, please?
Yeah, I think clearly the biggest impact on individual workers was the fact that they had no access to occupational sick pay arrangements in most cases. They would be on statutory sick pay, and that was the reason why the STUC and the Scottish Government actually signed that Fair Work statement with the no financial detriment clause in it, is because we know and we agree with them that statutory sick pay is insufficient to keep a household or a family. It's hardly enough to keep individuals head above the water. So, really, I think, and again, this is a reserve matter, but we need to ensure that people have enough funds to survive if their employment is taken away from them. Now, some people said to me, well, it was only 10 days, but that's a lot of money to lose and to be replaced by statutory sick pay. So, it actually went on longer than that for a lot of people because they weren't fit to return to work after that 10-day isolation. But that was all they got the grant for, was the self-isolation period.
Yes. Thank you. In paragraphs 121 to 144, you talk about workplace outbreaks, investigations and enforcement. You say that Scottish Hazards made freedom of information requests to Public Health Scotland, the Health and Safety Executive and local authority environmental health departments to find out about workplace outbreaks, interactions between regulations and employers, and enforcement action taken as a result of breakouts. But you found that breakouts hadn't been properly or consistently noted. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you think are the main impacts of not recording outbreaks adequately?
I mean, the reason we did that freedom of information request was to try and get an idea of what was actually happening out there, and it goes back to what we said earlier about the confused regulatory framework, and I think we were, first of all, surprised, but in reflection we probably shouldn't have been, in relation to the small number of cases that the HSE had actually been involved in, inspected, provided advice on, or issued notices on. And then, the issue in relation to Public Health Scotland, and this may well be down to the fact that as an organisation it was still in its infancy, but they didn't seem to have any mechanism or any system in place to gather that information in a way that actually was useful. To say that the figures that they supplied may include instances of single outbreaks or single cases, that was not an outbreak. And we would have thought the public health body for Scotland would have appreciated that these should have been recorded separately. That is a one-off incident. And then, as our statement shows, depending who was giving you the information, whether it was a local authority or Public Health Scotland, there seemed to be an inconsistency in relation to the information supplied by local authorities and that from the public health body.
Do you think that the inadequate recording led to less enforcement action than there should have been?
I think it should have been. It should have. It should have been a trigger to say that we need perhaps to do some more enforcement or more effective enforcement. It certainly did not do that. It actually, I think made our belief that it was a complicated picture out there even more stronger. Again, that was supplied to the Safer Workplaces group, but I think it would be something. I think if there'd been more enforcement and more communication of the findings, but perhaps if that HSE figure had been 200 cases instead of 20, and the message was getting out there that they were out there and they were doing enforcement, then that would have had an impact on the amount of people that were being exposed to COVID in their workplaces.
So overall, there may have been fewer outbreaks if there had been better recording and enforcement.
Yeah.
Do you think there's anything, again, that the Scottish Government could have done to improve recording, reporting and enforcement?
In relation to enforcement, I think obviously, and I think that the figures that we received would say that a lot of local authorities were actually doing good work in relation to enforcement, but I think they were probably limited to local authority enforcement. Well, Public Health Scotland as well. Yeah. They have enforcement powers, but their enforcement powers, I believe, tend to be through local authority environmental health officers. So, but really, and again within the local authorities, it didn't seem to match up in relation to smaller local authorities appeared to be doing a lot of work, whereas larger local authorities gave us figures that indicated that they should have been doing a lot more. There seemed to be a lack of consistency between local authorities in relation to size and how they were actually enforcing.
Thank you. Now, is there anything that we've not covered today that you would like to address at this point?
I mean, I think in relation to the work that we did and I think supporting individuals, we've got within that evidence there's quite a few cases referred to that were part of that 46 cases, and I think really the issues round about these individual cases were all similar. It was down to lack of adequate risk assessments. It was down to lack of consultation. It was fear, that people didn't want to exert their rights in relation to health and safety at work, and also just being treated with dignity and respect at work. And really, I think these cases, and when I was reading through the statement again, they're all fresh in my mind in relation to the individuals that were involved, the impact that had on them. I mean, the mental health that came through and the panic that came through within these calls into the call centre, it was astounding. It was astounding, and people, particularly vulnerable, people who had vulnerable relatives that were, expecting some sort of empathy from their employers in relation to their domestic situation, were not getting it. There's two, there was two that sort of struck me, was where people were, and this was health and social care cases, where people had, one was the individual themselves that was awaiting a trial, a medical trial, a drugs trial, that would, if it was successful, obviously have a positive impact on the rest of her life. But the employer, and this was a public sector employer, was not playing ball, because she would not have been accepted for that drugs trial if there was a COVID infection in the workplace. So our view was, the employer should have been doing as much as possible to reduce that possibility of infection for that individual. Another very similar case in health and social care was a woman whose child was awaiting a similar access to a drug trial, and she was in a work environment where social distancing was absolutely impossible. So, she had to take the choice, they both had to take the choice to sign themselves off from work in order to ensure that the individual, and in the other case, the loved one of the caller, was in a better place to be accepted in that drugs trial. But that also happened in relation to cancer. People who were going through cancer treatments or had been through cancer treatments and were returning to work, and just looking for measures to be put in place to ensure that when they came back to work, they were they were going to be as safe as reasonable and practicable. But we had a positive story that came out of one of it was a National Health Service employee who had been through cancer treatment, was wary about going back to work. And I learnt from that the wards had been classified red, amber and green, and the employer were actually, I think, as part of her return to work plan, suggesting that she only worked in green if possible, but potentially amber, but they were going to try and keep her away from the red working environment. Now that individual was actually saying, well, I've always worked in that red working environment and I really want to get back to that. So that was a positive case where the employer was doing the right thing to manage that transition into the workplace.
Thank you. Grateful to you for highlighting those cases, and I want to reassure you that all of the cases that you've detailed in your statement will be considered by the inquiry during our investigations as well.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Tadker.
Yeah.
Right, 11:15, I think, Ms. Barami.
That's right. Thank you, my lord.
Good. Now, good morning again, Ms. Barami.
Good morning, my lord. Our next witness is Kathleen Jenkins, who's a trustee and charity secretary for Scottish Hazards.
Very good. Good morning, Ms. Jenkins.
Good morning, my lord.
And
Yes, when you're ready, Ms. Barami.
thank you, my lord. And for the record, Ms. Jenkins' statement reference number is SCI WT 0471-501. Good morning, Ms. Jenkins. Please could you tell us a bit about your own background and your role within Scottish Hazards?
I'm a trustee of Scottish Hazards and I play the role of secretary. I've been involved in Scottish Hazards since 1993, but I wasn't always a trustee then. We were not a charity until 2014. We became a charity. I became the secretary in 2002, and initially did that as part of my work. I worked in public health, health promotion, and in workplace health. And so initially I did the Scottish Hazards work partially as part of my work, and then I just carried on doing it. The other strain of it was that I've always been involved in the trade union movement, and so it kind of married my professional life and my union commitment.
Thank you. Your colleague, Mr. Tasker, told us about the Scottish Hazards helpline, and you speak about that in paragraphs 21 to 24 of your statement. Can you tell us, were you involved in the work of the helpline?
I was not involved in casework, but what I was involved in was I was the Scottish Hazards representative on the COVID Safer Workplaces group of the Scottish Government, which was initially called COVID Restart, I think. But I was the hazards representative on that, so I attended meetings fortnightly, really, over the period of the pandemic. And so Ian and I, our CEO, our caseworker, and I worked together so that I presented. He did the casework, but I presented to Safer Workplaces Group the casework reports.
And I believe at paragraph 25, you mentioned that prior to the pandemic, Scottish Hazards was a member of the Partnership on Health and Safety in Scotland. Can you tell us a bit about that group and Scottish Hazards' involvement with the group?
The Partnership on Health and Safety in Scotland was started before I got involved in it. I know our CEO was involved earlier when he worked for the STUC. And it was really created because health and safety is not a devolved matter, and there should, at UK level, the understanding was there should be a tripartite group looking at health and safety. And so I think the Partnership for Health and Safety in Scotland was created in order to try to develop a tripartite and wider reference group, I guess it would be called, for Scotland on health and safety matters.
Thank you. And you go on to say that it was as a result of that membership that Scottish Hazards was invited to join the Safer Workplaces Advisory Group. Could you tell us a bit more about that group and Scottish Hazards' involvement in that group?
Yeah, I think FAS was approached to identify stakeholders that should be on the Safer Workplaces Group. And Scottish Hazards had been actively involved, and so was invited to be part of the Safer Workplaces Group. We met. It was the COVID team of the Scottish Government that set it up. I think I'm not quite clear about the hierarchy within the Scottish Government at that time, but it was the COVID team that set it up, and it met fortnightly for a couple of years. It had all the enforcers on it, so it had the police, local authority environmental health, it had the HSE, obviously Scottish Government, and various different bits of Scottish Government, so communications people and people who were developing guidance. It had the STUC, ourselves, the Federation of Small Businesses, the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations, the CBI, you know, it was quite a wide group of people looking at the workplace health and safety implications of COVID.
And in between the fortnightly meetings, did you have communications with the group as well?
Yes, yes, we did, and the Scottish Government people in the group were very helpful, and as a matter of fact, we were at one point assigned a specific couple of people that we would liaise with, so we had separate meetings with them so that we could feed back what the casework was telling us, and also any of our concerns, and they could also ask us questions about what's happening. So that, but also there were some subgroups of the Safer Workplaces group, like on ventilation and other things that we sometimes participated in. There were also a number of, well, there'll be situations where all the members of the Safer Workplaces group were asked to respond on a certain specific issue, particularly to do with guidance, because we were involved in advising, I suppose is the word, on the development of guidance. And we were all asked to communicate to our networks what came out of it. So it was a kind of two-way street. We had input in from our casework and from our knowledge about what was happening in the workplace, and then all the people in the group were kind of communicating what was said about guidance and things to our wider networks.
What impact do you think the group had?
From my perspective, and I think others would bear this out, I think it was important in ensuring, as far as possible, you know, it wasn't always what we wanted, but that guidance represented the reality of what was happening in the workplace, I suppose. And I think it did, I think the group did influence that. And also I think the group did play a part in communicating what was being said within the Safer Workplaces group and within the Scottish Government to our networks. And I think, yeah, I would just say that. I think we felt it was a positive move on the part of the Scottish Government to try to be as inclusive as possible of the stakeholders in workplace health and safety. And we appreciated that.
Thank you. In paragraph 41, you mentioned that you met separately with the Scottish Government, separately to the advisory group. You mentioned just in your evidence of meeting with people, I'm not sure whether that's a reference to the to meeting people involved with the advisory group, or if that also referred to meeting officials that were separate to that.
No, this was part of the, it was the Scottish Government people who were on the advisory group that set up a separate kind of conduit, I suppose, for us. I think they did that with other parts of the advisory group as well, because obviously the meetings were limited in time.
So presumably those, the direct contact gave you more of an opportunity to raise particular matters. What sort of matters did you discuss? Were the matters raised through your helpline or other matters? And what type of outcomes did you hope to achieve from raising those matters?
I think that the matters that we raised were similar to the matters that were raised in the wider group. It was just that we had more opportunity to go into detail. And we raised issues coming from casework. We also raised issues coming from a wider knowledge. I mean, my trade union branch, for example, represents social care workers. So I had some information coming from that source, which wasn't part of the Scottish hazards, but we could bring that in. And we could raise concerns about non-compliance in workplaces and about miscommunication, the things that you will have heard from the casework from our caseworker in more detail. So we were able to raise concerns about, masks, ventilation, all sorts of things, enforcement, was a big one because we felt, we'll probably get onto that, but we felt because COVID-19 and the pandemic was not being seen as an occupational health matter, it wasn't being as strongly enforced or as strongly communicated within workplaces as it should have been, and we did talk quite a lot about that.
And were you satisfied with the response that you received from the officials?
I think they were very welcoming. They welcomed questions. They tried to give us feedback. We were able to bring our cases to them. We didn't get all of what we were asking for in any one case, obviously. But I think it was helpful to us and hopefully helpful to them that conduit existed.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I would say one of the things that we weren't successful in was that we were very much saying we represent non-unionised workers. This has been important in the pandemic. The Scottish Government has funded that, and we would like to pursue with the Scottish Government continued funding for that. And I think that the people that we met with were sympathetic to that. But what we had was COVID money, and that was disappearing. So it wasn't possible to follow up on that. But in other ways, I think they were trying to take what we said into guidance.
Thank you. In paragraphs 47 to 50, you speak about vulnerable workers and health and social care. Can you tell us a bit more about the type of workers that you supported and those that you considered within that group to be more vulnerable?
Well, the first thing I would say is that most workers in social care are women. And I know that in terms of COVID specifically, women were not more at risk than men. But these were women who were often, well, mostly low-paid, often older workers who were more susceptible to COVID, often looking after families who brought COVID in. So I would say the first group is women to some extent, although with those provisos. Precarious workers who were working in low-paid jobs who had very poor contracts, quite often on zero-hour contracts. And that was a problem. And of course, there's evidence that people who are in lower socioeconomic groups are more vulnerable. People who had low immunity themselves because of a variety of situations, illnesses, conditions, whatever, or who had vulnerable children or people that they were looking after within their own family, so they were more at risk, immunosuppressed, etc. People from Black and minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities, long-term conditions. So there were a whole range of women who were pregnant, who were working in social care. So a range of people who were more vulnerable.
Thank you. In paragraph 54, under the heading of austerity, you state that the care industry was already in crisis leading up to the pandemic. COVID did not create the crisis, it exposed and exacerbated the crisis already affecting the sector. This is something that we've heard from other witnesses as well. It's clearly has been an issue. You also say earlier in your statement at paragraph 50 that about 80% of care homes are private businesses and the majority of care at home is private or third sector enterprise. Given that, what do you think could be done or could have been done to address the issues faced in that sector, particularly by the Scottish Government?
How long do you have? I think that the whole, I mean, it's just a huge debate that's everybody knows is going on now within the Scottish Parliament, within Scotland, within the UK, within the world, which is how do we provide social care in a way that meets the needs of users, but also creates a good situation for people working in it. And that's unpaid carers as well as paid carers.
Yes.
Obviously, we were looking at paid carers because we were representing workers, but it's very much the same, many of the same situations for unpaid carers. So I think I would say, and I think Scottish Hazards would say, that we need pretty much a root and branch look at how social care is provided, and would argue for a parallel system much more like the NHS.
Okay.
So it would be we very much support the role of the third sector. We would argue for a not-for-profit system, which, like in the NHS, which would retain more of the money going into the sector for the sector, rather than that there's evidence which we can point you to that, a good chunk of money is going out of Scotland even. So we would argue for a not-for-profit system that would be mainly public service, as is the National Health Service, that would be a service in its own right, with reasonable paying conditions for its workers and with collective bargaining, as in the National Health Service. And we are involved through the trade union movement with, working through Fair Work and such to try to argue for that collective bargaining. We would certainly argue for a role for the third sector, but we would think that the private sector, obviously not all at once, but gradually should be reduced, and that it should be a public service providing care for people from the cradle to the grave, really, in a much more joined up way. And I suppose that, and I could go on for a long time, but I think that another main thing is that the service needs to be preventative. I mean, at the moment it's a crisis service, and people with moderate needs don't get anything. And so we're building up trouble for the future, whereas if we have a preventative service where intervention can come much earlier, and that, I think that social care workers would argue for that as well, because they're frustrated that they can't really spend the time with people that they think they could, in helping them deal with life, really, and get on with life. So you can ask me more if you want, but as I say, I could go on for a long time.
Thank you.
I would just add also, and I'm sure you have evidence of this, that there's something like 30% vacancies in the sector.
Yes.
And there's a very high turnover, and there's a high rate of agency work. And all of those things put more pressure on the workers that are already in the sector, which means that they then go off sick or they then leave, and there's a recruitment problem. So and that was all there before COVID, but it was exacerbated by COVID.
Yes. Thank you. In paragraphs 60 to 72, you talk about the lack of union recognition and membership in the care sector. And this is again been highlighted by others as well, particularly compared to the NHS, where there is significant union involvement. Can you tell us, in your experience, what are the issues, the primary issues that affect non-unionised workers in workplaces?
Well, I mean, I would refer to the Scottish Government Fair Work agenda, and it has now said that one of the key, Fair Work First priorities is employee voice. And that means people working in the sector, working in an individual workplace, should have a voice. We have legislation that says workers must be consulted on health and safety matters, both in non-unionised situations and unionised situations. And so I think that, the lack of trade unions, and also I think Fair Work and other bodies, including the HSE and the Scottish Government and the UK Government, acknowledge that trade union workplaces have better employee voice and also are safer. So I think, you know, the fact that most of the care sector is non-unionized puts up the workers in a much weaker position to raise issues. So what voice means that people who are working in a sector or a workplace can raise concerns without fear. Although, I mean, obviously it's not perfect in unionized workplaces, but it's much better. Can raise issues without fear. And that employers will consult on health and safety matters, on other matters with workers, and that joint approach will actually create a better situation for everyone. And, you know, many employers agree with that. Many employers who have strong unions in their workplaces would say it's much better because, you know, we have somebody to talk to about how do we deal with issues. So any change in health and safety matters must be by law consulted with. And I think the other thing I would say is that in unionized workplaces, excuse me, a fundamental of our health and safety system is risk assessment. So there should always be a risk assessment that identifies all hazards in the workplace and says, well, what action can we take if we're identifying risks? And risk assessment should always be done with workers because they're the ones that do the jobs. They're the ones on the ground that know what hazards they're running into, and you know. And I think what we find is that in non-unionized workplaces, risk assessment is not always done the best it can be. Sometimes it's not done at all, and it certainly isn't always done in consultation with the workforce, which makes it a less adequate risk assessment, we would argue.
Yes. Thank you. We've heard from others that those in the care sector felt particular pressure to continue working even when they were unwell. You also mentioned this issue in your statement. Can you tell us more about what you consider to be the main issues there and how they could be addressed?
Could you repeat that? Sorry, I was thinking.
So we've heard a lot from others, and you mentioned in your statement that workers in the care sector felt pressure to continue working even when they were unwell, even if it was COVID that they'd contracted or suspected they'd contracted. So I wonder if you have thoughts on the main issues that led to that, and thoughts on how that impact could be alleviated and prevented.
Right. I mean, I think I would start out by saying social care workers want to do their job. That's why they're doing it, mostly. And therefore, they're looking after very vulnerable people. And so often they will want to continue work as much as they can. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that many social care workers, unlike health service workers, many social care workers don't have sick pay arrangements, and therefore, you know, they're in a situation where if they're going to take time off, they will be on SSP, which is pretty low, and not really able to support families. So that's another issue. I think there was also, in some cases, and you know, I'm not as up to date on all the individual cases as our caseworker, but there was some pressure from employers to say, you know, you have to come to work because we're short of staff. All the things I was talking about before, the problems of social care, that, you know, we're short of staff, we have to do the job, etc. So I think that all of those things played in to people being reluctant to take time off, to self-isolate or whatever.
Thank you. And do you have any thoughts on how that could be addressed by the Scottish Government or by any other organisation?
Well, we have argued for many years, because obviously the issue of sick pay is not just about the pandemic. It went well before that. And we know that workers go into work when they're not well, because they won't get sick pay. And that's been an issue that's been recognised by unions and by other people at Scottish level and at UK level for a long time. The sick pay arrangements in the UK are worse than in most of Europe, I think. And we would, so in terms of long term, we would argue that sick pay arrangements within Britain, Scotland and Britain, should be looked at. That the SSP should be, statutory sick pay should be higher, that there should be more of an onus on employers to provide sick pay arrangements. We know that the Scottish Government did have a scheme during the pandemic to support workers on low pay to self-isolate. We understand that there were some problems with that, but I can't give chapter and verse on that. I think it's something that, you know, the inquiry should look at. But I know the Scottish Government did try to do that. I would also argue that, you know, our definitions of low pay are very low, and therefore there will have been workers who wouldn't have been eligible for that, who wouldn't have sick pay arrangements, who might have also felt that they really needed to go into work because of the pay situation. So I think it's a fundamental problem. It wasn't a pandemic problem.
Yes.
It just was heightened by the pandemic.
Thank you. You go on in paragraphs 79 to 81 to talk about staffing levels, training, increased duties and responsibilities. With regard to those matters and staffing levels, perhaps in particular, what were the main barriers and issues in this regard?
Well, I've said already when I was talking about social care that there's a real recruitment problem, which reflects all of the problems that are in social care. Yes. And I've said some of those, which are, you know, low pay and precarious contracts. Also a lack of autonomy. I think many social care workers say to us, you know, we're the ones that are working with the people we care for, but we don't really have much decision-making capacity as to, okay, maybe I should spend a bit more time with Mrs. X this week rather than Mrs. Y. But many social care workers aren't really enabled to do that. They're very restricted. You can only be there for 15 minutes. You have to then go to the next person. Many of them aren't paid. Well, I should say some. Some are, but some aren't paid for travel time, so they then shave off time from going from one person to another. This is care at home workers I'm talking about. So I think that all of those problems are there in social care. Training is a big issue because, you know, social care is a difficult job. It's a skilled job. It's one that needs people to understand what they're doing. And during the pandemic, and I think before the pandemic, social care workers were increasingly being expected to do more, like give medication, things that they're not trained to do. I mean, I know social care workers, care at home workers who deal with people with epilepsy, for example, who are dealing with people having fits. And, you know, so there is an increasing, probably also because of strains on the health service and on things like district nursing and everything, there's more being asked of social care workers. But the training is pretty limited, and we know that some social care workers are hired and go straight into care work without any training. Some get very small amounts of training before they start. And then ongoing training is also an issue. And we do know of situations where, for example, people have to pay for their own training, have to do it in their own time. So training is an issue, and we have argued in the discussions about a national care service that there should be a national training program which absolutely requires to have training, pre-training, even if it's fairly short, and ongoing training. So, yeah, that's what I would say. I think training is a big issue and really important for both the workers, but also for the people that they're caring for.
What do you think have been the main impacts on workers' mental and physical health of not having training, of staffing levels being low, not being given time to go between patients during the pandemic?
Ooh. There are some what we might call, hard physical health and safety risks. Lifting and handling, for example. The lack of staffing sometimes means that where you should send 2 people in, you're only sending 1. And lack of training on lifting and handling is also a risk, particularly if people are people's homes. Sometimes there's a hoist, but quite often there's not. So there's that. There are risks of violence and aggression. People are working with users who are very vulnerable, but also very frustrated often that they're maybe not getting the care that they need. And so there can be aggression, and I think there's a real need for training to how do you deal with that. And another thing that we find from social care workers is a lack of support and supervision. So everybody that's working in a situation like care, where they're working with people, should have good support and supervision. They should have somebody they can go to and say, I'm not sure how to handle this situation. And there's a lack of that for some social care workers. So the backup, in a sense, isn't always there. We get reports, and this is not just us, but it's been shown in research, that there's a fairly high level of stress at work, so that there are mental and physical responses to stress, which can be lowered immunity, which can be mental health problems, physical health problems, and that comes from all those things I said, a lack of staffing, so more pressure on the people who are there, lack of support and supervision. Also, not always great working hours. Sometimes there are split shifts. Sometimes, people are working and then they're off work and then they're on work, and they can't really have their family life as well. So also long working hours. Care workers do quite a lot of unpaid work, and or paid overtime. So a whole range of things that are stressors, which can then result in ill health. I would also say for care that during the pandemic, there were health and safety issues that could impact on health. For example, there was a lot of emphasis given on PPE, for example, on safely disposing of it. Yes. But in somebody's home, that wasn't always possible. We know of care workers who were taking bags of used PPE home on the bus, things like that. So that was definitely, a risk to their health and to the user's health. And I was thinking of another, and ventilation. So we found, we were arguing right from the beginning of the pandemic as Scottish Hazards that ventilation was important, but it didn't get picked up because the WHO and other national, international bodies were not seeing this as an airborne virus. But ventilation in people's homes and in care homes was not always what it should be, and that was obviously exposing workers to COVID and other infectious diseases.
And we'll come back to ventilation. In relation to the impact on workers' mental health and physical health, the issues that you've spoken about, do you think that the Scottish Government could have done more to address those issues? Do you think more guidance would have been helpful, or do you think this was an enforcement issue?
I think...
Or something else?
I think it's definitely an enforcement issue. I think that we say in our evidence, and I think other people have said the same, that the fact that this was not seen as an occupational health issue meant that enforcement by health and safety enforcers, and that's the health and safety executive and local authorities, was not as good as it should have been. And that meant that employers were not being pushed as hard as they should have been, I think. Some employers were amazing and did everything they possibly could. Others didn't. And employers were not being pushed by enforcement or through enforcement or the threat of enforcement to do everything that they possibly could to look after their workforce. I think on specific social care, well, that was true of everybody. And I think the Scottish Government worked quite hard within public health and within devolved matters to try to provide what they could, like the sick pay situation. But the Scottish Government was constrained by the fact that health and safety law is reserved, and that therefore health and safety enforcement is reserved. And I think we argued, and I think the Scottish Government to some extent did this through the Safer Workplaces group, to try to make it really clear to employers what the law said about health and safety, even though it wasn't Scottish law, it was not devolved law. But they tried, to say it's a responsibility of employers to look after the health, safety, and welfare of their workers. I think in terms of social care, it's such an ingrained problem that we need to go back to the root and branch and say that there are situations in social care that are going to create mental health issues because of the stressors that are on workers. And I would also emphasize on unpaid carers, maybe even more on unpaid carers. And that wasn't something that could be resolved within the scope of the pandemic. And I think it's something that the Scottish Government is looking at through the National Care Service Bill, and but at the moment we don't know how all that will get resolved. So I think it's a more long-standing issue than just the pandemic. And there wasn't going to be a resolution within the pandemic unless the Scottish Government or the UK Government had been able to say, okay, we're going to pay Scottish, healthcare social care workers more. We're going to give them better training. We're going, and that within the scope of the pandemic just didn't happen and probably couldn't have happened, but should have happened.
Thank you. You've mentioned that the pandemic wasn't classed as an occupational health emergency, and you talk about that in your statement from paragraphs 82 to 91. That it, in the view of Scottish Hazards, it was an occupational health emergency as well as a public health emergency. In your opinion, what were the consequences of the pandemic not being recognised as that? Is it limited to what you mentioned, that employers weren't then pushed to carry out certain obligations, or in your view, does the impact of not categorising it as such have other consequences as well?
Well, I think that there's a number of things, but I think enforcement is important. I am not somebody who says enforcement's the only thing that should happen. Obviously, education, communication, support, all has to happen. But in the end of the day, and this has been recognised by the House of Commons in a report and everything, enforcement is a very powerful tool to shift things in the workplace. And I think the message, which was, this is not an occupational health matter, this is a community matter. In other words, people who we now know were contracting COVID in the workplace were told that they were contracting it in the community. And employers were told they're contracting in the community. It's because they're sharing transport, or they're coming on the bus, or it's not being spread in the workplace. We now know that it was, but at the time, and I think that the UK government and the Health and Safety Executive were very firm on that. You know, they were, when we questioned them and the unions questioned them and other people questioned them, they were consistently saying, no, 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 this is not an occupational health matter. This is a public health matter. It's not being spread in the workplace. It's being spread in the community. And as I say, we now know from evidence of which workers were worse affected by COVID, that health and social care workers, for example, transport workers, you know, a range of workers did contract it in part through the workplace. But at the time, that wasn't recognized. And so because of that, employers didn't get that message, and the enforcement wasn't there. Now, the Health and Safety Executive did do spot checks, but they were not full checks. They weren't done by health and safety inspectors who'd been trained to do that. They were done by people being brought in to just do spot checks on very limited COVID measures. So it was partly that the enforcement wasn't there, partly that the message wasn't there. And I think, you know, we found in the Safer Workplaces group that that message was held to more strongly by the Health and Safety Executive than by local authority environmental health officers. They tended, certainly in the Safer Workplaces group, to acknowledge more that, you know, there were workplace situations where it was being spread. So there was a somewhat of a difference of interpretation there.
Yes. What do you think led to that difference of interpretation? Was it pre-existing practices, or was it down to guidance being too vague?
I think, well, I'll just be honest, I think it was because that was UK government policy.
Okay.
And the UK government very strongly now controls the Health and Safety Executive. I think when the Health and Safety Commission was set up after the Act in 1974, it was more independent, but it has become, we think it's become increasingly more closely tied to UK government policy and politics. And so, to some extent, we believe that the line that the Health and Safety Executive took about whether this was an occupational health matter or a public health matter was partly as a result of what the UK government was saying. And I think that left the Scottish government in a difficult position because it's not a devolved matter. And that, you know, we worked in the Safer Workplaces group, and I think the Scottish government did, to some extent, some of what it could by emphasising the workplace health issues. But it had its hands tied to some extent.
Yes. And you talk about these differences in paragraphs 96 to 116. Do you think that the way the local authority environmental health teams handled the spread of the virus, approached inspections and enforcement, do you think that was a preferable approach to the health and safety executives?
Yes, we would see it as one. And I can't say hand on heart that every local authority environmental health inspector did that, but definitely the feedback we were getting was that they were recognizing more the occupational health aspects of COVID, and taking action when they could. I mean, the other thing that I should say is that there has been an increasing, well, first of all, the Health and Safety Executive has been cut by 50% over the last 10 years. No, more than that, but since 2010. It was also cut before that, I should say. Local authority budgets have been cut. So the resources that the enforcers have been reduced considerably. The second thing is that the Health and Safety Executive has been told that basically it's taken the line that it will only proactively inspect very high-risk sectors, gas and oil, mining, construction, and health and social care, which we would argue, and education, which have many health and safety problems, are not seen as high risk. So they were not being proactively inspected. And I think, you know, there's a history to it as well, yeah.
Thank you. And you've mentioned it today, and you mention in paragraphs 92 and 93 about health and safety enforcement being reserved matters. You say that this hampered the Scottish Government's enforcement abilities, and you say that the Scottish Government should be commended for using its devolved public health powers to implement measures and guidance affecting the workplace, but there should be adequate means of ensuring measures are being followed. What were the shortcomings in those respects, and what do you have views on what enforcement action should look like in practice?
Well, I think that the public health situation was a bit confused, and I don't, you know, our caseworker would be better giving you chapter and verse on this, but public health measures were being used to look at workplaces. So if a number of cases came out of a workplace, then that was being referred to public health, and they were being said, you know, there's something happening in that workplace. But the enforcement that actually we found could have, the public health, under the Public Health Act, there are enforcement powers. It wasn't being used. It was, you know, they were going in, they were giving advice, but there wasn't enforcement being carried out. Also, I think that there was some confusion between environmental health, public health, the police, you know, who's enforcing what, or who's looking at what, who's responsible for what. So I think there were a number of places where the use of public health could have been better, and that the powers that Scotland does have under the Public Health Act could have been used better. So we say, yes, it was good that they used that, but it could have been used more effectively in a number of different ways.
Thank you. And following on from that point about the different organisations involved, in paragraphs 111 and 112, you talk about the overlaps between different enforcement bodies and the importance of the Scottish Government working closely with them to remove some of the risks of reporting and investigation of breaches and failures falling into the gaps between those organisations. Could you expand a little on that?
Well, I'm not an expert in this because I'm not part of any one of those enforcement bodies, but you've got the police and some of the laws that were brought in under COVID, like stay at home, were actually police enforcement. So that was complicated because, you know, the police were then in a situation where were they going to have to stop people on the street and say, why are you not at home? You know, there was a difficulty in enforcement there. But there was also confusion between the the police and environmental health, who also have an enforcement role in communities. We've got the Care Inspectorate, which has an enforcement role, which mainly looks at the health and safety of users of care, of residents in care homes, for example. It doesn't have a wide remit to look at the health and safety of workers. So there are gaps where that falls through. You've got the SSSC, which registers social care workers and has an enforcement role in terms of If a social care worker is found to have broken the rules or something, they can be reported to SSSC. But they aren't as linked up as we would like with the care inspectorate, because we would say, well, some of the workers that are reported to SSSC, it's as much a systems problem as it was the fault of that individual worker, that something happened in the and so we would argue that there should be a closer link between that and the care inspectorate, who are looking at the systems that are in place in care. Then there's the health and safety executive, which is responsible for the health and safety of workers. And we would argue that all of these groups do communicate, and there are, I can't remember what they're called, but agreements between them as to how they'll deal with individual cases and things like that. But we think that it does fall through the gaps. So the health and safety executive has a responsibility in care homes and care at home for worker health and safety, and also for patient health and safety. And sometimes we're not convinced that the care inspectorate and the HSE and the SSSC all are working as much together as they could be. And I think I think that the Scottish Government, we think the Scottish Government could play a good role in bringing them all together, which it did to some extent. Now, the care inspectorate wasn't in the Safer Workplaces group, but the others were. Well, SSSC wasn't either, but I know they were meeting with them separately. But again, in our evidence to the National Care Bill discussions, we are saying, that the whole enforcement aspect, governance and enforcement aspect of social care should be looked at, and that there maybe could be an amalgamation of some of these enforcement bodies.
Thank you. In paragraph 110, you state that the Scottish Government could help reduce confusion and increase compliance by fully communicating the law on employer obligations within its guidance. We've heard from others about how guidance was difficult to understand and follow, and the volume of guidance made things more difficult. Do you consider that adding those legal obligations might exacerbate those issues, or do you think it would actually make things simpler and easier to understand and follow for employers?
Well, we felt, and I felt very much in the COVID Safer Workplaces group, that saying categorically, the law says you have to do this, is a pretty clear message, rather than it's important that you consult with your workers, and So that was what we were arguing, and although that was not a devolved matter, all it was doing was stating the situation, which was the law says, the 1977 Act, the 1996 Act say you have to consult with your workers. The law says you have to do risk assessments. And it felt to me that, and I think to us, that was a simpler message. So I wouldn't argue that it would complicate things. I think that the issue of guidance being complicated we all knew that. And we spent a lot of time in the Safer Workplaces group talking about communication strategies, talking about how could it be made simpler, how could it be made easier for employers and workers to find information. And one of the roles that we played, and that the Scottish Government recognised that by funding us, was to be a place where people could come and say, we're confused, and get, and our caseworkers knew the guidance down to the last penny, or drop a period or whatever, and could say, no, this is what the guidance says, or this is what, and we also did that. That was mainly for workers, but we also did that for small employers, because there was confusion. And the Federation of Small Businesses, who was very active on the Safer Workplaces group, they were saying many of the same things we were, and they spent a lot of time providing interpretation of the guidance for small businesses. And we worked with parts of Public Health Scotland, for example. We did some training for citizens advice bureaus, for example, to try to say, no, this is what the situation is. This is what the guidance says. This is the best health and safety practice. And, you know, so yes, it was complicated, and it was partly complicated because it was changing all the time. And that, I understand people's frustration with that, but I think that what was happening is we were running to keep up with the changing parameters of the pandemic, really.
Yeah. Whereas, do you think if there had been reference to existing guidance, people might have been more familiar with that, so it might have made their job of understanding what was required simpler?
Well, I wasn't speaking about guidance in that case. I was speaking about what the law says, because I think it, yes, and guidance.
Yes, sorry, I meant including that within the guidance to sort of set a framework for what was being required.
Yes. I mean, I think the guidance, the problem with the guidance was, well, I'm not an expert on this, but I think the problem with the guidance was that it was so fast changing that laying down a kind of framework didn't work because it kept changing. But I think that, yes, there could have maybe been stronger statements right at the beginning about a certain number of fundamentals. And those could have been that the law says this. It could have also been about ventilation. It could have, you know, but the advice, the scientific advice, was multi-layered, and I think not always heard, certainly at UK level, and to some extent in Scotland also although less so, I think.
So perhaps, following on from that, perhaps giving greater voice to the scientific community, or having specific experts attend meetings as matters developed and
I think I think that's beyond my pay grade to say that. But I mean, I think what I would say is that we have argued strongly that the precautionary principle should have been adopted right at the beginning. And that's a principle which says, if there's dubiety about evidence, if the evidence isn't clear, you take the precautions, you take a precautionary principle, you protect against that. So although the scientific evidence about whether this was an airborne disease or a droplet spread disease was confused at the beginning, we would have argued, look, the precautionary principle says you have to assume that it is. And therefore, you should say, yes, masks, yes, self-isolation, yes, ventilation, yes, you know. And if that had been done right at the beginning, I think the guidance could have been simpler.
yes,
Because that kept changing as well. You know, do we need masks? Do we not? Do we need FFP3 or FFP2? Or and if right at the beginning we'd said this could be an airborne disease, then the use of FFP2 and FFP3 could have been argued much more strongly, as well as much better ventilation, and working at home and all that stuff, which did come in. But I think adopting the precautionary principle at the beginning could have made it simpler in some ways.
thank you. And finally, I want to go back to the issue of ventilation, which you raised earlier as well. In paragraphs 132 to 147, you raised the issue of lack of awareness of ventilation obligations by employers, and again, the lack of enforcement measures. Can you expand on that, please, and whether there were particular issues in that area?
I think that there were voices, certainly within the hazards community and within some of the trade unions and some of the scientific community, right at the beginning, that we should treat this as an airborne disease. But nationally and internationally, WHO, UK government, there was a lot of opinion being said at international and national level that no, this isn't an airborne disease, it's droplet and fomite, surfaces. And so there was a lot of emphasis on hygiene, which wasn't wrong. I mean, obviously it was important too. And so it was a lack of, again, the precautionary principle to say this could be an airborne disease. So you had the situation in hospitals, for example, where hospital workers who were doing what was called aerosol generating activity were well protected by FFP3 masks, but workers who were working in wards with COVID weren't. And so a precautionary principle would have said everybody that's working in close proximity with patients who have COVID should be wearing good respiratory protection. And I think the other thing is that because it wasn't being seen as an occupational health issue, and because ventilation wasn't recognized at the beginning, although it should have been, as a key factor, there wasn't pressure on workplaces. There is actually law that says you have to have good ventilation in your workplace, but that wasn't being enforced, and it wasn't being emphasized within guidance or anything until much later in the day. If it had been recognized and had been emphasized right at the beginning, then I think that would have reduced to some level exposure in the workplace to people who eventually got COVID. So, and then there was a lot of discussion in safer workplaces about what ventilation measures, what kind of extraction there should be, what kind of, filtered equipment could be used in schools and not in schools, and there was differences of opinion within the Safer Workplaces group about that, which I think, again, possibly meant that, for example, schools didn't move on it as quickly as they could have done. I mean, that reflected disagreements at UK level, but we argued really right from the beginning that there should be portable filtrate mechanisms. I'm sorry, I've lost the name of them, in schools, in workplaces, and that, good advice about ventilation, whether it's opening windows or whether it's what kind of air heating and air conditioning system do you have, and is it up to scratch, and should it be measured, and having CO2 monitors in workplaces and in schools. All of that came quite late, which I think, again, with the precautionary principle, could have been done earlier. But I think the Safer Workplaces group took that very seriously, had a ventilation working group, and did put out a lot of guidance. So I'm not saying that wasn't done at all, but I think maybe not as quickly as it could have been.
Thank you.
10 minutes, Ms. Baroni.
Thank you, my lord. Now, we have your statement, and everything within your statement will, of course, be taken into consideration. Is there anything that we haven't covered today that you would like to highlight at this point?
I'll just have a think. I think you've covered most things. I think we have put in some evidence about the epidemiology report that was done right early on in the public inquiry, Dr. Cross report, and we've put in some evidence, and I've said in my report that although we don't disagree with anything he said, we think it was far too narrow, and that we would be keen for the public inquiry to look at other sources of evidence about the value of non-pharmaceutical interventions. So the value of masks, the value of social distancing, the value of isolation, of home working, and there's quite a lot of evidence which is not random controlled trials, which is what he was looking at, but which is more public health evidence and engineering evidence that has shown that, you know, many of these factors were are and were effective. And so we wanted to be sure that the public inquiry was aware of that evidence and could see that, you know, although, as I say, we're not disagreeing with anything Dr. Croft said, that it was very narrow. And I worked in public health promotion, and I know that many public health interventions, random control trials, are not really, well, they shouldn't be done, because that means saying, well, people in Glasgow will wear masks and people in Edinburgh won't. And, you know, you can't do that in public health. And so there's a lot of other ways of measuring the value of a public health intervention. So I would add that. Let me just see if there was anything else. No, I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Jenkins. Very good. 1:30 for the next session.
Thank you.